So the title is Everywhere Worlds Connect, Realist, Poetics, and the Ecologies of Capitalism. This is my first time, I'll come over here, my first time at this conference, but I've been so inspired by the conversations that have been ongoing in this network about a kind of expanding and reconfiguring Marxist concepts in sociological, historical, and anthropological directions to consider the world ecology. And so I'm a literary critic and a scholar of poetry and ecology, and so my work has been around expanding and reconfiguring Marxist concepts to think about literary works primarily. So this talk is thinking about Marxist aesthetic and literary concepts of realism and totality, and trying to think about those aesthetic and literary concepts, the ways in which they need to be reconfigured to think about the world ecology. And so the first half of this talk sort of sets up those terms and thinking about particularly the idea of metabolic rift, metabolism and metabolic rift, and then in relationship to these concepts. And then I shift into a discussion of two contemporary poets' work and the creative engagements with and embodiments of these ideas in and through their form, the forms of their work at all levels. Okay, so in his early work on aesthetics and form, soul and form, George Lukács poses a key question. Is it possible to grasp the innermost essence of our time, the essence that we ourselves may not know? For Lukács, the task of the modern literary work is to provide such a measure, discerning the deeper networks of relation that are often inaccessible to immediate perception, and rendering them experientially palpable through its form. In and through their formal uniting of dissonant phenomena, certain kinds of aesthetic works can convey the complex whole of social relations in a given present, according to Lukács. The well-known debate between Ernest Bloch and Lukács centers on this question of which formal modes are adequate to representing the contemporary field of social relations and on the larger critical definition of this present reality itself. In response to Bloch's critique of Lukácsian totality as an idealist concept of a closed and integrated reality, Lukács insists on the necessity of totality as a dialectical category vital for critical comprehension of present dynamics, and argues that the realist novel achieves this formal unity and variety, capable of illuminating the complex whole of a society in its contradictory dynamics. This talk extends Lukács' ideas of form and totality into new terrain, ecological and aesthetic, in the present. So I'm following the recent arguments by Gail Day and Katie Terazakis that argue, contra Jameson's influential arguments about the unrepresentability of totality, so the ideas of cognitive mapping, that totality in fact represents a thinkable critical orientation toward the present, particularly via the mediations of aesthetic form. Terazakis argues that Lukácsian totality is an arrangement made to accommodate cognition, not an achieved synthesis, but a means of formalizing thought in relation to a whole that exceeds immediate comprehension. As Day points out, Lukács' thinking on totality beyond its specifically delineated and increasingly rigid aesthetic parameters reemerges in unexpected ways in the works of contemporary artists, and it has taken on new life in various recent critical formulations as well. So here I'm asking how literary and specifically poetic works might think the totality in socio-ecological terms, providing a vantage on metabolic rifts and relations and rifts as contemporary shaping dimensions of contemporary life within capitalism. To address these questions, this talk turns to some key formulations of metabolism and metabolic rift, ecological concepts of Marx's that have found new traction in contemporary left eco-theory. It then points to a realist modality of poetry, attuned to the dynamics of world historical forces that include the ecological. So examining works by recent books by contemporary North American poets Eleni Siklianos and Jennifer Scapitone, I claim that these texts epitomize a different direction in contemporary poetics, departing from experimental and lyric comportments to convey in realist terms a planetary whole undergoing cataclysmic alteration. In their formal embodiments of appearance and essence, it's Lukács's key terms, these works provide means of conceiving the complex and precarious metabolisms of earthly life in late capitalism, and provide an alternative to some of the dominant tropes associated with Anthropocene discourse. In his recent book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, novelist Amitav Ghosh develops an argument about the failure of the realist novel to grapple with ecological catastrophe, particularly in the form of climate change. The modern realist novel, he claims, is built on logics of predictability and stability, oriented as it is toward the ordinary routines of bourgeois life. The necessary repression of the unpredictable or uncanny event, such as a freak tornado appearing in New Delhi, is essential to the workings of the realist text, which thrives on likely scenarios. Yet, Ghosh argues the Anthropocene epoch must be grasped as foundationally unpredictable, defined by sudden and calamitous environmental happenings. He writes, and it appears that we are now in an era that will be defined precisely by events that appear by our current standards of normality highly improbable. Flash floods, 100-year storms, persistent droughts, spells of unprecedented heat, sudden landslides, raging torrents pouring down from breached glacial lakes, and yes, freakish tornadoes. Sort of appropriate, actually, for the recent news. Pointing to the relative absence of literary works about ecological catastrophe, he claims that the failure of the realist novel to represent climate change, a failure that is grounded in its very structure and formal logics, is of a piece with a larger crisis of culture, a greater inability to apprehend the causes and effects of environmental crisis. Ghosh's ideas are framed around a fundamental opposition between the now of the Anthropocene and the prior stability of modern bourgeois life. The current conditions of the Anthropocene, Ghosh argues, force a reckoning with the impermanent and illusory nature of this previous stability. He writes, from the reverse perspective of our time, the complacency and confidence of the emergent bourgeois order appears as yet another one of those uncanny instances in which the planet seems to be toying with humanity by allowing it to assume that it was free to shape its own destiny. These oppositions, the planet versus humanity, prior normalcy and sudden crisis, appear with some frequency in Anthropocene discourse. Such considerations often center on the unique capacity of the species as a newly geological force to alter planetary dynamics. In so doing, they offer a certain version of totalizing thinking, one built around a narrative of historical rupture and a vision of the species as a generalized culprit. Yet for materialist thinkers interested in theorizing the historical interrelations between ecology and economy, such accounts fail to grasp the way these dimensions of crisis are not an uncanny conflict between planet and human, but a development of the capitalist world system and its dynamics of accumulation, exploitation, and appropriation. Conveying the complex material exchanges extending through and beyond the economic realm into various forms of ecological relations, a series of recent eco-materialist works have offered innovative ways of thinking the totality by expanding Marx's concept to consider capitalism's organizations of nature. These eco-materialist approaches draw on an expanded definition of Marx's concept of metabolism. Stoffbeschaffung. Did I say that right? Germanists in the room. A term Marx employs across his writings to describe the dynamic interaction between humans and their surroundings. Metabolism refers to humans' relations with nature as they are mediated by the labor process across various historical contexts. Evoking the forms of energy use, internal regulations, and cycles of a given system, metabolism embodies the complex interactive means by which life on Earth is maintained. In his work on capitalism's organization of nature, Jason Moore elaborates this idea to develop a framework of the oikos, a way of naming the creative, historical, and dialectical relation between and also always within human and extra-human natures. The oikos offers a description of a total field of relations, a world ecology, defined by co-constitutive forces that are at once making and unmaking each other always and at every turn. more emphasizes Marx's idea of metabolism as a dialectical concept, stressing the generative as well as destructive components of capitalism's organization of nature. His concept of the oikos focuses on ecological degradation, but grounds it in terms of nature's capacity to work. Work takes many forms in this conception. It is a multi-species and manifold geo-ecological process. It allows us to see that capitalism has thrived by mobilizing the work of nature as a whole. Yet this appropriative and exploitative character of metabolic relations in capitalism inevitably leads to certain forms of crisis, according to this argument. In Marx's use, metabolism speaks not to stability, but to ongoing and even cataclysmic historical transformations in ecological conditions, transformations that are constitutive of capitalism's organizations of natural entities and processes. Writing amidst the second agricultural revolution, Marx points to the depletion of soil fertility in the countryside and the one-way transit of labor and resources from country to city, which produces a division between urban and rural while accumulating pollution and waste in the cities. As Marx argues, this rift is not an accidental byproduct of capitalism, but instead a constitutive component of its progress. The social process of production under capitalism necessarily proceeds through an ongoing undermining of worker and earth, he argues in a well-known passage from Capital, Volume 1. We can in turn expand Marx's idea of metabolic rift, not only to describe the deteriorations in soil fertility associated with industrial agriculture, but the more generalized commodification of nature and capitalist production. Capitalism's productive relations depend on a profound simplification of complex metabolic processes discoverable in industrialized agriculture, and also the broader forms of extractivism and geographical development that are essential features of modern capitalist production that have devastating consequences for planetary diversity, biodiversity, and systemic health. For literary critics, the question then becomes, where might we discover cultural modes of representation attuned to these world historical dynamics, the world ecological dynamics? How might these complex workings of metabolic rifts and relations, as what Lukács calls a total life context within capitalist production, find symbolic representation in literary form? If, as Amitav Ghosh has argued, there are few examples of realist novels that might be said to be attuned to such forces and dynamics, we can, I argue, discover a broad tradition of modern and contemporary poetic work that moves beyond the appearances of social life to evoke through their formal architecture a world of broader forces in motion. It is perhaps the multidimensional capacities of poetry, its ability to jump scales and shift perspectives, along with its modes of formal intensification and distillation, which lends it the capacity to undertake such examinations. As Eleni Siklianos puts it, poems have all kinds of dimensionality. They're the original hypertexts, and hyper takes on various world forms. Poems in this mode that I'll be describing today work to narrate, this is Lukács' term, through referential portrayal, juxtaposition of seemingly divergent phenomena, and scale shifts, the world ecological coordinates of the oikos, the field of material interactions woven into, but also extending beyond the realm of human culture. From Muriel Rukeyser's and Mark Nowak's documentary investigations of capital's extractivist modalities in their reshaping and unmaking of laborers' bodies, waterways, and soil systems, to Ed Roberson and C.S. Giscombe's explorations of the intersections of toxic urban infrastructure and racial capitalisms, to the field works of Nathaniel Tarn, Kaya Sand, Juliana Spar, and Craig Santos Perez that chart violent histories of economic development and ecological degradation. These works illuminate capitalism's ever more intensive imbrication in biospheric processes and embodied forms. The realist dimension of these works emerges in their insistence on charting daily experience, as they survey the various ways metabolic relations and rifts become perceptible in the sphere of everyday life. They offer portrayals of what Marx terms the alienated mediation of metabolic relations under capitalism, not only in its material, but in its ideological dimensions, indicating moments of complicity or larger sociocultural structures of mystification. In all these ways, such poetry draws together seemingly heterogeneous perspectives and spatial orientations in order to open up imaginative modes of apprehension beyond the immediately given, moving between appearance and essence in dialectical fashion. So today I want to just turn, in the second half of this talk, to two contemporary examples. Eleni Siclianos' Make Yourself Happy from 2017, and Jennifer Scapitone's The Republic is the long title. The Republic of Exit 43, Outtakes and Scores from an Archaeology and Pop-Up Opera of the Corporate Dump from 2016. These are both mid-career poets who've been associated with experimental or avant-garde poetic modes, and their previous works have blurred the bounds between poetry and prose in some interesting ways, but this is really the books in which they've taken on these sociological questions in form and theme. So first I want to turn to Siclianos' Make Yourself Happy and sort of lead you through this book a little bit. I'm not going to talk about this poem, but you can read it and you'll get a sense of the texture of what I'm talking about in this first section. The first section of this text catalogs what Siclianos calls a tidy sum of pleasures, from travel to beautiful food and objects to drugs that a bourgeois subject feels entitled to. The poems at once immerse themselves in and ironize a bourgeois mode that contemplatively chronicles these pleasures available to a first world, first-person speaker. Various poems describe in whimsical tones and brief, sprightly lines the gratifications of eating croissants, cookies, donuts, or the happiness of buying a fancy thing. The language of this first section of the book, detailing all the ways to make yourself happy, seems to mimic the self-improvement jargon of the contemporary happiness industry, with its myriad self-help books, self-care goods and resources, devices for quantitative measurement and management of one's happiness. Such imminent attention to happiness as a contemporary American obsession is, of course, precisely the point. Siclianos' immersive focus on happiness highlights the way such aspirations and desires have become a central ideological structure of capitalist realism. While these descriptions have an ironic edge, Siclianos also wants the reader to confront the real urges and sensations bound up in this pursuit, so as to reveal somatic and psychological investments in forms of late capitalist living that bear larger consequences for planetary life as a whole. Make Yourself Happy asks, what is the material base of the phenomenon of happiness in late capitalist culture? In the following section, How to Assemble the Animal Globe, Siclianos makes a representational leap to a series of poems about now extinct animals from all parts of the globe. This unexpected shift recasts the prior poems in a fundamentally different light, highlighting dimensions of metabolic relationality and rift that were largely unthinkable in these prior meditations on bourgeois happiness. These poems on extinction are organized by continent, with several animals from each area, from the blue buck of Africa to the Tasmanian tiger of Australia, Oceania, represented in brief pieces that detail their daily behaviors, eating patterns, sounds, and physical characteristics. These portraits detail the metabolic relations between creatures and their environment, conveying the ways their capacities and habits adapted over the long reaches of planetary time to suit the particular dimensions of their surroundings. So one short poem about the Japanese river otter, which was declared extinct in 2012, is particularly evocative in its description of the otter's ecological niche. It ate eels, beetles, crabs, shrimp, fish, watermelon, and sweet potatoes. Here we catch a brief glimpse of the otter in its life world, surveying its very corporeal gratifications. Such lines reflect back on the bodily pleasures chronicled in the first section, reframing those daily activities in a more pervasively negative light in relation to the diminishment of species life across the planet. Reading these portrayals, we are confronted with the way these species' lives became bound up in capitalist productive relations, whether directly turned into commodity goods or as labor source, or indirectly as their habitats are developed for agricultural or industrial production. Siclianos includes photographs and drawings of these animals, largely in captivity or as dead specimens, which provide a powerful visual counterpoint to the text's portraits of lively beings. In these representations, metabolic relations transform into metabolic rifts, as settlements, steel mills, pipelines appear and these animals dwindle. These considerations extend beyond the realm of animal life, touching on the realities of climate change as well. The section on Antarctica features no species poems, only one word naming an endangered entity, ice. The reader is thus tasked with imagining the creaturely lives of animals now vanished and with envisioning ecosystems in the process of destructive transformation, as these poems show us the dead inside the living. Siglianos holds together disparate perspectives and phenomena, the lives of animals in ecosystems no longer existent, the alienated metabolism that accompanies the accumulation process, the eudaimonia of a certain subset of humans, to indicate the complex ways they bear on each other. The animal globe of the title becomes a means of thinking totality, defined in negative terms, the biospheric entities and processes whose depletion, degradation, or extermination express what Justin McBrien calls the becoming extinction accompanying capital accumulation. Make Yourself Happy offers a further formal means of envisioning totality, offering the animal globe as an actual assembly project for the reader. Printed amidst these sections descriptions of extinct species on various continents are pages with a cut-out drawing of a part of the globe, which with each drawing corresponding to that particular continent. On each of these drawings, the names of the lost species are scrawled in different ink colors. These pages are intended to be cut out of the book by the reader and assembled into a whole, a construction project that will destroy several